Thanks for joining us.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field. And now, please welcome your host.
You're listening.
I'm on the phone, sorry.
America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Welcome back
Can we
to
come
the program on Zev Brenner. And to Toronto, Canada we go. And we're going to be looking at, people think of Kaddish in sad terms. And yes, there's a certain amount of sadness, but there's some great inspirational stories about saying Kaddish, which even bring a chuckle. Some of the stories that I read brought a chuckle to my mind. With us right now is Rabbi Gary Zweig. He's written 2 books. First book is called Living Kaddish, which was a bestseller, was translated to Spanish and Russian. And his latest book is called Kaddish Around the World, Uplifting and Inspiring Stories, including stories from Rabbi Pesach Krohn, Rabbi Stephen Berg. So, Rabbi Gary, welcome to the program.
It's a great honor to be here. This is the big time, bigger than David Letterman, Jimmy Fallon, and Jimmy Kimmel.
I lost, at least you mentioned contemporary one. You didn't mention Johnny Carson, right?
Okay. No, this is great. This is fantastic. Thanks so much. Looking forward to it.
So tell me, so you've written 2 books, you focus on Kaddish, you also have a band that you perform different parts of the world, the Kaddish Club, but you also led services around the world. So what motivated you to write a book about Kaddish?
My father passed away 2 years ago at the age of 101. Till then, I did some services in Barbados, Sweden, Mexico City, Curacao, and I had to say Kaddish sometimes. And I wanted to write some stories from people who were uplifted. Since COVID, a lot of people stopped going to shul or didn't go to shul as much. And when I heard some of these stories, I was so motivated to say, we got to get them down, because that's the way to get people back. And I found from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Nepal, all over the world, including stories that I had from Spain, Portugal. It was just amazing. So that's what I decided to put it into a book. Thanks to Rabbi Pesach Krohn and Rabbi Stephen Berg from Aish. It really, really helped me out a lot. And I'm looking forward to sharing them with you.
No, by the way, I love some of the stories, even though my favorite story was about Kaddish at the Olympics, at the Super Bowl. I'm sorry. Tell us about Kaddish at the Super Bowl. That's a great, great story.
Kaddish at the Super Bowl was by Lonnie Ostro, who I spoke to himself. And I heard the story. It was so well told about how he did it and how he managed to coordinate getting a minyan at halftime in the Super Bowl. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but they had 14 people by the time he started the minyan and 27 people by the time he was saying Kaddish. And I thought, wow, that is unbelievable. So he actually gave a story of Kaddish at the All-Star game. I guess I can look forward to Kaddish at the hockey playoffs. We haven't got that yet, but one story leads to another, and you'd be surprised how you can actually manage to get 10 people. People play basketball. You play with 10 people, you can get a minyan. You can find a way. You can find a way, any way to do it, and really, it uplifts the soul so much.
Rabbi Guy, you have to tell the story, because it's a great story about how he was able to get at the Super Bowl where he didn't know anybody looked Jewish. Everybody's wearing caps. Ordinarily speaking, if you're in an airport, you see somebody wearing a baseball cap, good chance they might be Orthodox. But the problem is when you're dealing with the game, almost everybody's wearing a cap, right? So it's harder to use that as a yardstick to determine who's Orthodox. So how did he pull together the minyan? Tell the story.
It was 1998. The Super Bowl was in, I think, San Diego. It was the Green Bay Packers and Denver Broncos. And just before halftime finished, his assistant said, by the way, don't forget we have to say Kaddish. And he's like, what? He goes, no. He says, well, let's forget about it. He said, no, I'm sure you can get a minyan. He looks around. Finally, the kicker is he runs to the lost and phone and looks very worried and says, you got to help us. What is it? I just lost my kid brother. What's his name? Guys takes his pen. Okay, what's his name? Tell his name. His name is Mincha Service. How do you spell that? Service. Okay, let's see what we can do. Would Mincha service please come to the Lost and Found? That's Mincha service at the Lost and Found. And like I say, 14 people came, 27 people came at the end. And the Lost and Found guy asked him afterwards, who do you like in the game? He says, doesn't matter. Mincha service was the real winner today. That was it. Yeah.
That's a great story about getting together a minyan, a humorous one, but it worked. But you have stories from around the world. What is your favorite one?
Well, I'll talk to the one that happened to me. We have one about a safari in Kenya where a guy had booked his trip already with two other couples, and then he realized that it was the day of his father's yahrzeit, and he was struggling with that idea of should he go, should he not go. And believe it or not, the night of the yahrzeit, he's going into his place where he booked the lodge in Kenya, and he hears a lot of boisterous yelling and screaming, and he hears Hebrew. So 7 Israeli couples, 7 Israelis had booked a safari trip to Kenya that night. So he said, I tell you, it gets so emotional. He says he couldn't go to the minyan, so the minyan came to him. He actually said a minyan, and that's safari news. I have stories from 2 ones that stand out with me. It was in Spain during visiting the Rambam city. We managed to get a minyan because we found some kids playing that were from Morocco. They just happened to be there. We said a minyan in the Rambam's old shul. And in Portugal, that was another fascinating story. It's a community that lives in a place called Belmonte, and they've been continuous since the 1500s, since the Inquisition. And they've hid all their practices, and we found a minyan there. Oh, it's unbelievable. There's also a story in New York about Port Authority. Guy in the middle of Port Authority finds, I'll only do Kaddish if you find me a minyan. He finds a minyan. It's Rabbi Eisenman said that story. So there's so many exciting stories. The story of Israel. Only in Israel, the guy goes to the Sde Boker. He sees there's a time for mincha at 4:30. He sees the shul locked. He says, I'm wondering what I'm going to do. He sees some soldiers getting off a bus, and he says, would you help me for a minyan? Absolutely. They went and made a minyan just like that. So these stories are inspiring. They're unbelievable. And I should tell you another one, which probably is changing the face of the Middle East, the story by Rabbi Berg of Kaddish and Medina 1,300 years later. The first minyan in Medina, Saudi Arabia in over 1,300 years.
When was that? And what was the story behind it?
That was just recently, a few months ago, and they were going on some trade mission, I believe. And he was saying Kaddish for his father, and they ended up having a minyan, and that was unbelievable to be able to do that.
Now, how does it work? You go around asking people for the Kaddish stories. How do people know to tell you all these interesting tales from around the world?
So I get a story, and I got to have all details, because if I hear somewhere, somebody, somehow, somewhere, it doesn't add up. And my great copy editor, Elliot Katz, who's had his books translated into 25 languages, was a tremendous help. He'd say, it's got to be this, it's got to be exactly this, got to be this has got to sound better this way. Because just to say a Kaddish story, I was in an airport and I found a minyan, it's the same story. So each story had to be different, new. And, we have like 15 countries listed in there. And it's really inspiring. Again, I saw minyans fall off a little bit. But when you need to say Kaddish, you need to have 9 people around you. So everybody, the beginning of the book, there's a story from a guy, I just saw him last night, Yossi. He was saying Kaddish once, and he said, I would get a minyan. He says, you can tell everybody you're number 10. Why is that? Because without you, you wouldn't be number 10. You're number 6, you're not going to come. So you're number 10. So he managed to get a minyan that way.
Our guest is Rabbi Gary Zweig. He's in Canada, but he travels around the world. He's led services in various countries, and he's written 2 fascinating books about Kaddish. His first one was the bestseller, Living Kaddish. His newest one is called Kaddish Around the World, Uplifting and Inspiring Stories. And certainly a lot of uplifting and inspiring stories. Kaddish is a sad time, but it also is an enlightening time. People have gotten inspiration from various stories and various occasions where when they least expected, they got a minyan. You must have
absolutely.
Tell us about a story where you least expected, a guy almost was giving up by getting a minyan, and all of a sudden the miracle happened.
Well, I call this story From Russia with Love, where there's a Chabad Shaliach, and they never give up. But he was sitting there trying to make a minyan. His mommy was in New York airport, and Newark airport, and he's sitting there, and he sees a guy, and he says, "Will you help us with a minyan?" And the man answered, "Since the Holocaust, I have not participated in anything Jewish," and starts to walk away. He says, pulls his hair out, he says, "No, please, you're number 10. So he says, "Look, all I'm asking you, a mother who I'm saying Kaddish for had to travel, I'm not sure, was it 1,000 miles maybe in Russia, just to go to the mikveh?" That was in the time of communism. He said, "I'm just asking you to stay in there and just answer for Kaddish." And he did that. But I want you to know, you talk about emulating. I have a section in the book called Kaddish Calendar, which I'm proud of. Begins with the Shloshim and goes all the way to your site, 12 months, because during the 6 or 8 months, you maybe get bored or lose interest. So I have themes for each month. One might be Israel, one might be tzedakah, one might be Torah study, one might be charity. And one month I have is emulate the person. For example, you'll say, you know what, my mother used to make this recipe, or my father used to always tell me this, or my best friend always used to say this. This way you're keeping them in the conversation, and you really uplift their soul by doing that.
You had a great line in the book, which I think you quoted from another rabbi. Two things that kept Judaism alive: maftir and nifter, which means the bar mitzvah portion that a boy gives when he turns 13 when he reads from the Torah, or nifter when somebody passes away, what brings people back to the synagogue that ordinarily don't go, but they go to say Kaddish.
Yes, that was given by Rabbi Kalman, who's passed away, who's actually his son-in-law contributed towards this book. His son-in-law, Alan Gutenberg, contributed towards this book. And when he said that, it summed it right up because, you know, Haftorah, you know, Bar Mitzvah boy comes. And then, of course, when there's a passing. But I wanted to make it more meaningful by doing a living, the title Living Kaddish was because, you know, you're living the life of Kaddish and you're also making the person live through Kaddish. So it's something which I think it connects to everybody. I mean, it's certainly connect. I mean, the Russian edition has done very well because they always wanted to say Kaddish. And I really want to get it in Hebrew, if I can, because it just connects with everybody and everybody on their own level. I want to tell a brief story it's in the first book, Living Kaddish. It's called 16-Month Kaddish. There was a fellow who was saying Kaddish for a relative. I believe his mother was in Romania. He was in Ramat Gan. After a month, he was learning this, led the services. 3 months, 4 months, he's starting to lead them. First when they're back, he's starting to go 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, 13 months, 15 months. He's saying Kaddish, 16 months. You know what? Kaddish is 11 months, but he's saying 16 months. Finally, goes to the rabbi and says, "What am I supposed to do?" And everyone's looking at him like you're looking at me and saying, like, "What are you going to do?" And he says, if he says no, then he's going to leave the service. If he says yes, then he's lying. So he says, "My friend, technically you don't have to say Kaddish anymore, but you have to say one line every day." What is that? Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Olmei Almaya. May his great name be blessed forever and ever. When I heard that story, I said, you know what? I'm going to come to Minyan just to hear that line. If I'm late, if I'm early, you know, and that's really what it's all about. You know, Yehei Shmei Rabba. God should be blessed forever and ever.
Well, you touched on something very important. Kaddish is not really a prayer for the dead. There's nothing about death in the Kaddish prayer. It's all about God, praising God.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Another line says that we're essentially offering God lahavdil, consolation. You lost one of your creatures, God, but we still praise you every day. We still believe in you. We still have utmost faith. And, you know, really, when you think about it, it really is a Kiddush Hashem when people aren't so involved or non-Jewish people see you going to say this prayer for 11 months afterwards. It really is something which really is, you're doing so much for the soul. Also, it's the only mitzvah you can do where you do not expect any reward ever. Usually we think of maybe someone will give me an award one day. No, there's no reward. You just got to do because it's the right thing to do. So that's what I'm so happy you're touching on these points because these were points that I really wanted to get out. And now the challenge is getting people to actually get the book because everything's online, but you can't do Kaddish online. And I don't want to put it out as an ebook yet because then people can look on their phones. So I have as a written book. I'm going to working on it as an audiobook. If they're driving down, they can hear the stories. But essentially, once you get into the habit of saying Kaddish, then you can do it. Like, you don't have to say, I'm not going to do it. People put their limits of 1 week, 1 month, you know what I mean? Anyone can do it. Anyone can keep it up.
I'm curious. I don't have the answer to this question. I don't know if you do as well. People who grew up with some semblance of Judaism, may not be a lot, know they have to say Kaddish. But today's day and age, people so assimilate. I'm wondering if the same level of commitment to say Kaddish for a loved one still exists among the younger generation that grew up with much less Judaic values and really connection to Judaism.
It's a very good question. And I would say the ebook craze is a little bit harder. The people having the semblance of staying with it. But there's a friend who's not very involved, and he got the book and he loves it. And he's like, I mean, he's doing everything in his power to say, whether it's once a week. Another friend of mine, he took the transliteration. I have the transliteration in Sephardi, Ashkenaz, and Hasidic. He puts it beside him when he says Kaddish. I think we also have to slow down for people, because one thing I don't really enjoy is what I call steeplechase Kaddish. You see some of these experts, they just ram through it, really racing like they're off to the races, and the poor guy's saying Kaddish. So I think we have to slow down and make sure that everyone's around has to say Kaddish. I mean, this is just a major commitment for someone to do it. So, let's do it their pace. Let's do whatever we can.
Synchronize. People should be together. In fact, you're right about the fact that Kaddish is a unifying moment. Whether you're Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, you have a story about a law firm where at the end of the whole meeting in the law office, I think it was in front of a judge, an Orthodox judge. Tell us the story. Yes. It shows Jewish unity.
Well, there was one person who was being sued by other litigants. They were like Hasidic, etc. And it was about a property, and then it came around 5 o'clock, and the fellow saw his beard was a little bit, grown. He said, I lost my father a month ago. Then he says, Your Honor, I think it's time for our litigant to say Kaddish. The judge looks around and says, well, it looks like we have a minion. He says, which way is he? Judge says, don't worry, God will listen to you whatever way. So they said Kaddish, and it really struck out. He says, even though we're on different sides of the court, we said Kaddish. What can I say to you? Living Kaddish had its own amazing stories. One guy was on a canoe trip in the Arctic Circle. He had 9 people with him. He said Kaddish every day. It just works out. It just really works out. If you plan it out, it could work out. And I've had so many of those stories where, you're number 10, and it's especially today. I mean, I'd like the numbers to be what they were before COVID, and hopefully we can inspire other people. And you asked about younger people. I think there will be the same interest if you say to them, you're number 10 for a million. I don't think it's been explained to a lot of people, I did a service this Rosh Hashanah where we were 9, barely 10. I got some new recruits for Yom Kippur. We had 10 and 11. We had a healthy group of people. So if you tell people they're number 10, I think they'll start to come back. That's what it is.
They're not number 1. The number 10 is even bigger than number 1.
Exactly.
Now, You have something called David Letterman Top 10 Kaddish. Tell us about it.
David Letterman, of course, one of the cohorts of your story. A rabbi from Toronto said, I was saying Kaddish for someone, and the name of the guy was Paul Schaefer, who was a musician. And he says, I don't know who Paul Schaefer is. No, he's in the David Letterman show. He goes, well, I don't know David Letterman. He goes, well, it's one of the top shows around. He goes, well, you see, Kaddish brings everybody together. So you never know who you're going to find saying Kaddish. I think that's a wonderful thing for Jewish unity now, especially, in Israel. People have asked me, they said, oh, there's so much disunity. I said, you know what? I think they're more connected than you think. People think that they're so diametrically opposed, but I think they're more connected than we think. And hopefully Kaddish Around the World and Living Kaddish can help do that. There it is.
Certainly.
I hope people can get it before Yizkor, which is Saturday, Shabbat, because then they can make it as a gift or use it themselves.
They can read it. It's good. It's by Targum Press. It's certainly worthwhile to read some inspirational stories, and some of them make you smile, which Kaddish is a sad subject, but certainly you smile in a good way.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, you have also, I think your family comes from Lodz, Poland. You have something about Kaddish and Lodz.
Yeah, well, my dad had a story. I visited Lodge in 2017, and I never heard the story, but he told me that across from his house, there was a square where there were executions and people said Kaddish there. I never knew that all those years, and I just included that. Yeah, just 1 second, please. Yes.
And those that are just tuning in, you're listening to a special show about Kaddish around the world. Rabbi Gary Zweig. Go ahead, Rabbi Zweig.
No, I want to thank everybody out there. As I say, please get the book, Kaddish Around the World. Please give your comments. You can get it at Amazon, but try to get it from a local Jewish bookstore, which they have lots of them hanging around. And give me your thoughts. Give me your email. Give me your story for future. I'd love to hear about it. I'm really, really excited. And I want to wish you all a Chag Sameach, and thanks so much for having me on the air.
Does that mean, Rabbi Zweig, that book number 3 is coming out?
It's all in the works. Just send me those emails and stories, and I'll start writing them.
Rabbi Gary Zweig, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. Take care.
Book is called Kaddish Around the World.
Thank you for tuning in to
Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
Thank you.
Continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.